Well, thanks everyone for joining this discussion on the ocean outcomes from COP25 and next steps for 2020. I'm Gwen Taraska, the Director of the Climate Program at Ocean Conservancy, and we're very pleased to have with us Amanda Hansen, Deputy Secretary for Climate and Energy at the California Natural Resources Agency, Sue Biniaz, Senior Fellow at the UN Foundation and Climate Advisors, and Jean Flemme, Director of the Ocean Defense Initiative. Overall, there was a lot of disappointment in COP25, given the reluctance of major economies to commit to increased climate ambition. But one bright spot at the COP, maybe the only bright spot, was progress on ocean issues. And this is significant because governments have largely overlooked the ocean in the international climate effort to date. In advance of the COP, Chile, which holds the COP presidency, named COP25 the Blue COP in recognition of the linkages between the ocean and climate change. But there was always a real question over whether COP25 would be successful as a Blue COP. To answer that question, we were looking for two overarching outcomes. The first was progress outside the negotiations track by way of governments and leadership coalitions coming forward with ambitious commitments that would set the standards for ocean climate stewardship, and Amanda will be speaking to that in a moment. The second was progress inside the negotiations track by way of the first ever ocean section in a COP decision, and Sue will be speaking to that. COP25 did make progress on both of these fronts thanks to the leadership of California, Fiji, Costa Rica, and a number of other ocean climate champions. Although there is, of course, still a lot of work left for 2020, both in international forums and domestically. And Jean Flemme will be speaking to the outlook for U.S. progress at the national level. So thanks for joining this discussion. We'll have ample time for Q&A, so please take note of your questions and we can pose them to our speakers after their remarks. So Amanda, let me turn things over to you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for organizing the call. I think it's really helpful to take some time to reflect on the busy, incredibly busy 2 weeks that everybody spends at COP. There's always so much going on, and appreciate the opportunity to kind of walk through some of our reflections after participating. So just by way of introduction, my name is Amanda Hansen. I serve as Deputy Secretary for Climate and Energy at the California Natural Resources Agency, and I work for Wade Crowfoot, who's the Secretary, and unfortunately unable to join today, but was in Madrid along with Jared Blumenfeld, our Secretary for Cali, PA, and my counterpart at Cali, PA, Lauren Sanchez, the Deputy Secretary for Climate Change. And I think, it was a really, from our perspective, and I understand the sort of sense of frustration at the end of what I understand is the longest COP in history, which is amazing. But I think, I would point you all to Wade. Wade wrote a little blog about this, but I will just kind of tick through some of his high-level reflections that we, discussed on the long plane ride home from Madrid, which is, and also by way of background, I used to be on the U.S. delegation many moons ago, from I think 2005 to 2011 or something. And so it was really interesting for me to be part of a subnational delegation. And I think we actually walked away from Madrid feeling really inspired by the number of conversations we had with national and subnational entities who are extremely on implementation. This is where our focus is. This is where we want to make our biggest play moving forward, is in implementing solutions. And so it felt really exciting to connect with so many other entities who are thinking through the same very difficult challenge of implementation, associated with implementation, in whether it's reducing our emissions or adapting and building resilience. The emphasis on ensuring that as these changes take place, that we're doing so in a way that supports all members of our society. So the focus on a just transition was also just incredibly appreciated, something we're thinking a lot about in California. I'm very interested in connecting with others on how they're doing that and what it means. I think the work on oceans, I mean, we were just so grateful for the opportunity to sit on a panel with other, launching members of the Pacific Rim Ocean Climate Action Partnership, which includes Fiji, Costa Rica, Panama, Peru. This is a partnership that we hope to build in a significant way moving forward. We've got a big year ahead leading with, we've got the IUCN Conservation Congress, we've got the UN Oceans event in June in Lisbon, there's Climate Week, there's the CBD COP in Kunming, there's the, obviously COP26 in Glasgow. So just a huge arc ahead. And the idea of taking the work that we did, and I thank the leaders within the Ocean Protection Council here in California for helping to navigate this, to just really work with other Pacific Rim countries and subnational entities to do more work in the ocean climate space. And specifically, it was fascinating. Wade walked away just really enthused with some of the things he learned about marine protected areas and other cultures that have been doing this for many, many years. So how can we, again, I think California is very focused, obviously want to tell our story, but we also have a lot to learn. And so it was really special to sit and join other countries who are as dedicated to ocean climate issues as we are, and think through, learn from the choices that they've made. I think kind of lastly on sort of big picture reflections is the focus on nature-based solutions. Our agency oversees the state's policies on forests, on oceans and coasts, water and land conservation. There's just a lot of great work that we can do in this space, and we're really focused on thinking about how we can increase our ambition here. So again, it was very inspirational to be at the COP and hear so many people talking about those kinds of climate solutions. So I will also just say, we in addition to launching the Pacific Rim Partnership, we also signed a bi-coastal East-West joint statement for reflecting multiple states' support for the Blue COP, and are really committed, again, to working with our partners in the Under 2 Coalition and the U.S. Climate Alliance to not just do our part as California, but to do our part as California as a member in some of these broader coalitions that are high ambition and committed to doing good work. And I think, looking ahead, as I mentioned, we have a big year with a lot of opportunity to showcase our efforts, to partner with others, and to learn from other countries who have, and subnationals who have begun this work. So I think with that, I'll wrap it up and just say thanks again for the opportunity to join the call.
Thanks, Amanda. And also just to note that several of these announcements from leadership coalitions at the COP are in the handouts tab if you're joining by computer, as well as the COP25 decision text. So turning now to Sue, just wondering if you can tell us about the outcomes or non-outcomes in the official negotiations track, including progress on ocean issues specifically, and what it means for next steps in 2020.
Well, thanks, Gwen. Let me start with the oceans bit and then talk about some of the other outcomes / non-outcomes, as you put it. So as many of you know, Gwen and I have been helping Fiji and several other parties that are members of this Friends of the Ocean and Climate Coalition come up with different things that they could push for in the COP and outside the COP. So part of this past year was spent trying to figure out, well, what could we do within the COP that would help to better integrate ocean issues into the work of the UNFCCC, and basically coalesced around the idea of trying to get some kind of dialogue to go on these kind of nexus issues between ocean and climate at the session of the subsidiary body known as SUBSTA next June. Okay, so that was the goal, and we came up with a decision text that could have either been freestanding or part of an overarching decision, and it essentially had 5 elements in it. So I think I'm just going to compare for you the original elements and then the outcome on each of those elements, just so you can get a sense of what we went in with and what we came out with. And, I think the outcome was definitely a positive one. Of course, it's not exactly like what we went in with, and that was to be expected. So element 1 is we wanted something in there about, like, why is this even an issue? Why are we trying to integrate ocean issues into the UNFCCC? Like, why is oceans related to climate? We had a long list, maybe 5 or 6 different interactions between ocean and climate, and that did not make it into the final text, but there are like at least 2 references to why it's important to tackle these issues together. So that's kind of a partial win. The second issue was we wanted a dialogue, as I mentioned, and that was actually the most important thing. I think that if everything else fell away, the main thing that we wanted to get into this decision was that this subsidiary body would conduct a dialogue on the kind of nexus issues between ocean and climate, and that, is definitely in there. So that's number 2. Number 3 is we wanted to affirmatively call for submissions, not only from parties, but from non-party stakeholders on the interaction between ocean and climate and how to better integrate the issues into the UNFCCC, and that survived also. So that's number 3. Number 4 did not survive. Number 4 was a specific request from Norway, which we totally agreed with, although we thought wasn't like strictly necessary. What they wanted was an affirmative reference to the fact that this dialogue would invite representatives from outside the UNFCCC process, like, for example, from ocean-related, endeavors, agreements, institutions, organizations outside the UNFCCC to talk about what they were doing about climate in their ocean-related processes, which makes perfect sense because we had always been thinking we need better integration, not just in the UNFCCC with respect to oceans, but kind of the mirror image, better integration of climate into ocean processes. So that paragraph didn't survive, I think, just in an attempt to kind of shrink the section, but they could still be invited. So we'll just have to work on making that happen, de facto, even though it's not in the text. And then the 5th element was language that said that the chair of the SUBSTA, the subsidiary body, would make recommendations back to next year's Conference of the Parties. That got weakened to the chair of the SUBSTA making an informal summary report. It's not as big a gap as it seems, because even the original proposal was for recommendations as appropriate back to the COP, which could have ended up being like no recommendations. Okay, so I don't think that's like a critical difference. The COP next year can still take up the issue of like what to do about better integration of the ocean into the UNFCCC. So the bottom line is, like, I think most of these elements got in there in some shape or other, and even the one that didn't make it in, which was like inviting representatives from outside, can still happen in real life, even though it's not there. One of the complications, just so you know, and one of the things that like dragged down the ocean section a bit, was that Saudi Arabia came in at the end and basically said, we want equal time for land, not just ocean. And this was, I guess, it was a bit of a surprise to us working on the ocean, but if you think about it, it wasn't that surprising because they're the ones that had pushed for the IPCC report on land as sort of a counterweight to the IPCC report on the ocean. So their game, I guess, was either to push land so hard that oceans would drop out and you'd end up with nothing, or that they would get something on land for equal time. So because they insisted on some kind of parallelism between the two, like if there was going to be a dialogue on the ocean, there also had to be a dialogue on land, et cetera, it ended up kind of scaling back the whole enterprise. Having said that, though, there's several paragraphs devoted to the ocean, and it's really the first ever section on the ocean in one of these COP decisions. So I guess I feel like we should declare victory. in terms of looking ahead, the submissions are invited by the end of March in 2020. So, the next thing I suppose people should focus on, and we should have a call at some point, is like, given that submissions are also invited from non-party stakeholders, what should the content of those submissions be? Like, what are the most important things to emphasize on the nexus and the integration in the UNFCCC? So that's the readout on the ocean section of the decision. Just 2 minutes on the rest of the negotiations. You've heard Gwen say, and you've probably read the press reports, that people were disappointed with the ambition level. I'm not sure how realistic it was that there would be some huge ambition section in the decision, because decisions have to be agreed by consensus, and you have enough countries that are not about to promise to raise their commitments in 2020 that it wasn't, I guess I never thought that realistic to think that there was going to be some full-throated endorsement of everybody raising their ambition next year. In any event, what many had hoped for, some kind of call for parties, all parties, those parties in a position to do so, to enhance their nationally determined contributions next year, ideally to put in some kind of timeline, like parties that are going to enhance their ambition to do it by some kind of date certain in 2020, et cetera. But none of that actually ended up happening. So if you look at the decision of the Paris parties, you basically just see repetition of past decisions, mostly repetition of things that were decided in Paris 4 years ago. And so it does feel very much like a least common denominator outcome on ambition. So, that's the reason why, in part, people were disappointed with the COP outcome. Another reason why they were disappointed was the actual issues under negotiation, which were kind of slated to be done at this COP. One of them was the market mechanisms article. That actually was slated to be done a year ago and didn't get done last year. So the question was, will it get done this year? Because there were very strongly held views on many of the issues, and in a way, things got even more complicated this year, or not necessarily more complicated, but maybe more controversial, because parties had another year to kind of dig into their positions, and even people who weren't focused on that issue last year became focused on it, because it was really the main issue, negotiating issue at this COP. So what happened there is that parties came close to reaching agreement, but at the end of the day, were not able to. China was a problem at the end on one of the issues, trying to sort of carry over some of the kind of emissions units from pre-2020 over post-2020, so they'd be able to use it to meet their Paris targets. And others kind of rejected that idea. Another complication was that some of the developing countries were trying to put what amounts to basically a tax on each transaction, each market transaction, each transfer of an offset or an allowance, which was rejected by not just the U.S., but a lot of other countries. So the market mechanisms issue is basically just carried over until next year. And so, I don't know, someone's going to have to figure out over the next year, now that they've failed twice to reach agreement, like how does that get done? The other issue you may have heard a lot about was this issue of loss and damage. There, it's a pretty arcane issue in a way. The mechanism under the climate regime that's supposed to deal with loss and damage was supposed to be reviewed this year. It's been reviewed every couple of years. One of the issues was considered a governance issue, quote unquote, and it's basically an issue that like almost no one in the world pays attention to, which is like, should this mechanism report or should it be supervised only by the Paris Agreement or also by the Framework Convention? So that sounds like an issue that no one would be at all interested in. But what happened was, and I think the press has largely gotten this pretty wrong, what happened was when we agreed to this mechanism, this Warsaw International Mechanism in Paris in 2015, the U.S. only agreed to it on the condition that it was made very clear in the Paris outcome that this had nothing to do with liability and compensation, because in the US, loss and damage had sort of taken on overtones of liability and compensation. So that was kind of the deal. And this year, some countries were saying, oh, we want this mechanism to apply not just under the Paris Agreement, but also under the Framework Convention, to which the US and others replied, well, we could go along with that, but it would have to be clear that that same proviso about no liability and compensation would also apply to any of the work of the mechanism under the convention. To me, that makes perfect sense. Anyway, that was completely blown out of context. And, you know, the next thing you knew, Tuvalu was saying that the US was trying to escape liability for loss and damage, but it actually had nothing to do with like the merits of escaping liability. It was basically this issue of like whether that sentence applies to the mechanism under both agreements. So I think that was an unfortunate kind of mischaracterization of what happened at the Madrid COP. So in any event, some of the loss and damage stuff was resolved at this COP. Some of it's carried over on the, you know, more governance-related issues. And as I said, market mechanisms is carried over until next year. And obviously, ambition is also carried over to next year, because 2020 is the year when parties are not required, but maybe expected or encouraged to increase their ambition. So that's my readout. Back to you, Gwen.
Thanks, Sue. I think it really puts into relief how remarkable it was to get an outcome on oceans given the politics. So let's now turn to the domestic context and to Jean Flemma to discuss the congressional context and what we can do to motivate progress at home.
Thank you. And I would just want to start by apologizing in advance for any pounding that you hear in the background. My house is quite literally being seismically retrofitted today, and there are people drilling giant metal plates into my foundation, so I apologize. So first of all, I really appreciate the readout from Madrid. Of course, I wished I was there, but not having been there, it's great to get better perspective on what happened with respect to the ocean, and in particular, as you just said, how achieving something on the ocean there was so significant given the other things that happened. So here at home in the United States, in general, at the national level and from a legislative perspective, I think we need to look at 2020 as a year for education and consistent and persistent messaging to convey the urgent need for significant ocean climate action. I think we would love it to be a year of real action, but given the current political dynamics and the fact that it's an election year, that seems very unlikely. The good news is there has been much more attention paid to climate change and the need for ocean climate action in 2019 than there has been in years. The House spent 2019 spotlighting the climate emergency with the establishment of the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, and multiple committees held hearings and passed legislation to begin to set a track record on the need for action. So a few highlights: in June, we saw the passage of several ocean acidification bills that are now pending in the Senate. In September, Congresswoman Bonamici introduced a resolution highlighting the findings of the UN SROC report and detailing the need for ocean climate action. Senator Markey introduced a similar resolution. In October, Congressman Cunningham introduced the Climate Ready Fisheries Act, which is intended to ensure that fisheries managers have the tools that they need to better manage fisheries under changing conditions due to climate change. And last week, the House Natural Resources Committee passed a package of coastal resiliency bills that were intended to help local communities plan for and prepare for the impacts of climate change. That too is now pending in the Senate. And in addition, we saw several members of the Democratic caucus in the House and a few senators. I think Senator Whitehouse was on the CODEL that went to the COP for the first several days of the COP, which was an important message from Congress to other world leaders that we are still in with respect to the Paris Agreement. Looking ahead, some of you may be aware that Congresswoman Bonamici is planning to introduce a bill to strengthen federal research on blue carbon and monitoring and mapping for blue carbon. Her bill will create a national map and inventory of coastal blue carbon ecosystems and their sequestration potential, improve protections for existing blue carbon ecosystems, and restore degraded ecosystems. Yesterday, another important piece of legislation, Congressman Grijalva and several of his colleagues introduced legislation, HR 5435, requiring federal agencies to achieve net zero carbon emissions from public lands by 2040. This would include net zero emissions from the outer continental shelf lands. The bill includes a 1-year pause on all new federal fossil fuel leasing to allow the federal agencies to develop a comprehensive emissions reduction strategy. And leasing could only resume after they found that it would be consistent with achieving net zero emissions by 2040. In short, I think what we can say is we've seen a lot of action in the House in 2019, and I think we will continue to see a lot of action in the House in 2020. But unfortunately, I don't think we can expect similar levels of action in the Senate given the current political dynamics. So given that, what should we focus on in 2020? Last week, I participated in a roundtable on ocean climate action with several members of the House Natural Resources Committee. They were joined by Congresswoman Bonamici and Congressman Beyer. And for me, there were 2 takeaways from that event. First, that the members really want to focus on solutions. They don't want to just talk about the doom and gloom of the science. They really want to talk about solutions and what we should be doing to take ocean climate action. And second, that they are looking to us, the community, to continue to drive the messaging that ocean climate action is needed now, and there's significant interest in having us continue to spotlight that urgency, but also to continue to emphasize the opportunities for the ocean to be part of the climate solution, both in terms of adaptation and mitigation. So I think for the ocean community, this is a critical time for us to continue to drive that messaging. And many of you worked with us in September to pick up and push out the messaging about the ocean as not only being impacted by climate change, but as an ocean, as an opportunity for solutions to climate change. When the UN SROC report came out, there was a lot of people that rallied around that messaging here in the United States, and that I think was very effective. And we need to demonstrate, we need to continue to push those messages out, but also to demonstrate the appreciation for decision makers in Congress that are focused on ocean climate action. So in March of 2020, the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis recommendations are expected, and that we anticipate that will include a series of nature-based solutions and recommendations that will be both land and ocean focused, and that'll be an important opportunity for us as a community to support, champion, and amplify those recommendations. And I think as we continue to hone and develop ocean climate solutions and recommendations that we've all been talking about, we need to be sharing those recommendations with decision makers and continuing to emphasize the need for action. And I think we have seen that when we develop messaging or propose solutions, there are many decision makers at the national level that want to embrace them. So as an example, thinking back to that SROC messaging that we developed with Ocean Conservancy and NOPC and the UN Foundation, that was the toolkit that we pushed out at the end of September. When we shared that messaging widely, in addition to the community using it, we saw more than 50 members of Congress also use that messaging. And I think that's a great sign of their interest and their desire for collaboration with the community. And we need to capitalize on that and continue to drive the solutions that we're all working on forward. But I think at the same time, it's also important for us to continue to highlight and support the efforts we are seeing by the states like California that Deputy Secretary Hassan talked about, that many of the states right now are the leaders on ocean climate action, as most of you know. And I think it's really, really important for us to not only be continuing to shine the spotlight on those actions by the states, but also champion their efforts in any way that we can. So I'm going to leave it there, and I think let the further discussion take place during the questions.
Great, thanks, Jane. So we have time for Q&A. So Theo is going to explain how to submit questions.
Hi, everyone. This is Theo Koboski with Ocean Conservancy. I'm helping run some things behind the scenes here, including the question portion of the webinar. So to submit a question to our panel, there is a tab on the GoToWebinar tab bar called Questions. So you can write out your question in the box there. If it's not pulled down, just click Questions and it'll give a little drop-down box where you can actually type out your question and hit Submit, and that will come through to us here on our end, and we will be able to share your questions with the panelists. One of the reasons that we do this is just with a large amount of folks on the phone, we can't necessarily get to everyone. But when we see the questions, you'd be surprised at how many people actually have similar questions or the same question. So it helps us kind of just get a sense of the field of questions that we have out there and try and get to as many points as we can before the end of the session. So before I hand it back to Gwen to field some of the questions, I actually selfishly am going to ask the first one. I heard Sue mention that there was some discussion about including the actors outside of the UNFCCC process, and I'm just curious, what some of those opportunities for engaging with folks outside of the UNFCCC process, what some of those opportunities are in 2020, just how else we can sort of see that integration of ocean and climate action on the international stage.
Well, thanks for that question. I guess I can give you one specific example and then one less specific example. Let me give you the specific example. So negotiations are going on at the moment on this BBNJ instrument, which is basically biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, okay, which is essentially, the high seas, right? And it's about protecting the high seas. Okay, so there's a section in there on identification. It's Article 16, if anybody really wants to follow this. Identification of areas requiring protection, right? So these are what criteria should the parties take into account when they're deciding which areas of the high seas kind of deserve protection, whether it's through a marine protected area or some other kind of management tool. And there you have in brackets as one of the proposed criteria, the adverse impact of climate change and ocean acidification. An alternative is vulnerability to climate change. They're both in brackets, right? So, one of the things that could be done by people who care about the linkage between ocean and climate is to also focus on this ocean agreement and make sure that the climate-related aspects of ocean degradation and ocean protection get into this agreement, and Gwen and I know from having facilitated a lot of the meetings of the parties in the climate context that most climate negotiators are like completely unaware that this negotiation is going on, or they were unaware. I mean, we brought it to their attention, said, domestically you should be coordinating. One of the problems is a lot of countries are organized in such a way that their climate departments are like completely unrelated to their ocean departments, which obviously affects, the interaction at the international level. So that's one example of a process going on outside the UNFCCC that could use some climate attention. Okay, the other thing is the UN Ocean Conference, which is coming up this summer in Lisbon. When I talk to people at the COP who are working on that about, well, what's the climate component of that ocean conference going to be, I sort of got blank stares. So I think people need to think through, well, should be the climate component of the UN Climate Conference. It would be a shame, having just gotten what we got into the UNFCCC, to then, you know, turn around and have the next ocean conference not include something on climate change. So, yeah, anyway, those are two examples to think about.
Thanks, Sue. So another question is for Amanda and the California team. So in addition to announcements at the COP on the Pacific Rim Initiative, what else were you seeing at the COP as far as implementation of ocean climate action? And on that front, I know that California had a hand in the Pacific Coast Collaborative guide that was, you know, meant to serve as a sort of a global example. So wondering if you could speak to that.
Sure. I mean, the guide is, I think, kind of just the starting point for ways that we could walk through with an interested partner, kind of how we've taken the approach that we've taken. And so I think, you know, to the extent that people are interested in digging a little bit deeper or going farther, I'm very confident that our team at the Ocean Protection Council, who spends so much of their you know, blood, sweat, and tears thinking this stuff through and then executing on them, can go into far more detail. I think, you know, one of the areas that came up in a number of conversations, and honestly, I mean, it went beyond the ocean climate nexus. It was essentially, you know, how are we going to meet all of our targets? Was kind of, there was just so much interest in understanding some of the mistakes that we made. So we really thought that was interesting, is people do not want to reinvent the wheel, and it's helpful to understand kind of what didn't work and why, which took us, I think, a little bit by surprise. It just makes so much sense. So to the extent that, you know, we could walk through some of the issues that we ran into in building out marine protected areas, that was a very welcome conversation, both on our end and on the end of others. So I think it's not just necessarily about sharing solutions, but also in sharing kind of lessons learned and maybe areas, things to avoid in building out solutions, so people can essentially leapfrog where helpful.
Thanks, Amanda. So one other question that has come in is about the protests, which I think got a lot of press back in the U.S. So I think this question is maybe more for Sue. So what is your perspective on the student protests from your position sort of within the negotiations process, and what did they illustrate to you?
Yeah, so there was a student protest sort of in the streets of Madrid, and then there was a later protest, and I'm not sure this was a student protest, but there was a later protest sort of inside the halls of the conference. So I'm not sure which one is being referred to, but I probably in both cases, you know, I think the overwhelming view was that kind of those protests just served to show the kind of the gap between what society is demanding, whether it's students or others, members of the public, demanding in terms of action, and then kind of what this process is delivering. So I guess that's, you know, on the one hand, it's kind of inspiring to see so many people care about this issue. It's also kind of depressing as you realize that the governments are not delivering the solutions. So I guess that's my reaction.
Thanks, Sue. So one other question that has come in, I think could be put to any of the speakers. They're wondering, what are the recommendations, if any, for philanthropic donors to engage in the conversation on ocean-based mitigation opportunities coming up in 2020?
This is Jean.
Well, this is.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead,
Okay,
Amanda.
sorry. Thanks. Sorry. I mean, I'm sure, as all of you can imagine, I was sitting here thinking, well, what wouldn't be a great opportunity for philanthropic engagement? I mean, I'll speak from California's perspective. You know, we are really interested in thinking about building regional climate resilience and focusing on some of the threats that are, you know, immediate, but then also those that are longer term. And so I think, to the extent the philanthropic community is interested in engaging with the state in thinking through essentially funding to support community and regional resilience, we would be very interested in partnering on that. You know, the LAO in California just came out with a report with recommendations on sea level rise and what can the state do, and what I believe it also delves into what local and regional governments can do to protect communities in the face of sea level rise. And so I think maybe looking to that report and thinking about ways that we can partner would be something that, you know, we would certainly be very interested in. I think really when it comes down to it, you know, we struggle with the fact that building climate resilience is a very significant upfront cost. And, you know, it's going to take financing and funding both from kind of all sources. And so being strategic about that and thinking about who makes sense to engage where is a conversation that we would really welcome to have, you know, offline with any interested parties.
Well, that was actually a great sort of setup for me, which was, this is Jean, I was going to say that another opportunity would be for the funders to look at what the states are doing, like the things that Amanda just described, and think of them as models for export to other states where potentially action may not be as you know, rising to the top as quickly, and how we can use, as Amanda said earlier, the lessons learned and the solutions and the lessons learned to develop models and opportunities for other states who want to maybe take action but don't know how, or who just may not be as advanced as California and some of the other states. I think that's one opportunity as you know, a model for export, not just here but also international export. But I think in addition, how we look at what the states are doing as potential models for federal action is another area of potential opportunity.
Great, thanks, Jane. So 2 questions have come in for Sue, so I'll just ask them back to back. Firstly, you mentioned that Saudi Arabia was problematic in getting the text through. Were there other countries that were trying to block? And what were their reasons? And then secondly, what do you expect in the SEPSA dialogue in June 2020? What do you expect that to look like?
Thanks. I don't think I wouldn't say that they were problematic in that they were anti-ocean. They weren't anti-ocean. They were just trying to capitalize on the proposal regarding the oceans to get in their dialogue on land, right? So they sort of, you know, used it. And because there was a lot of interest in the ocean proposal, they were able to get in their land proposal. There was really no country it was kind of remarkable, that was against the ocean proposal. I mean, there were edits around the edges. I mean, some countries did not, they were okay with sort of a one-off dialogue, but did not want to prejudge like what would come after the dialogue. They didn't want to sign on to, you know, an agenda item on the ocean in perpetuity. So, you know, we basically had to comfort everybody by saying the way it was drafted was very neutral. There'd be this dialogue, there'd be an opportunity for submissions, but, you know, we were not prejudging what was going to happen after, because if we tried to do that, we would have gotten nothing. Okay, so there really weren't problematic countries on the topic of the oceans in general. There were just issues with respect to like exactly how the thing was drafted and how much enthusiasm there was for, taking this up like forever as opposed to in 2020. Okay, in terms of what will happen at the dialogue, I think that's completely in the hands of the parties and, in a way, non-party stakeholders, because like there is no vision at the moment. Everybody is supposed to put in, or well, everyone who wants to is invited to put in a submission by the end of March, and it will basically be on the basis of those submissions that the coordinators figure out, how to structure the dialogue in terms of topics, in terms of who's invited to speak, whether we end up inviting representatives of outside processes, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why I said I think we should have a call at some point. I'm sure Gwen can organize it on, like, what should that dialogue look at, and what's the best way to make that happen.
So maybe a follow-up to that, Sue. So someone wants to know what lessons the NGO community might have learned in participating in COP25 on the ocean front, and how they can work together constructively in the future. And maybe you already answered this with respect to submissions, but if you have any other thoughts on that.
Yeah. Well, I think it worked. I think whatever cooperation there was worked well. One lesson was zero in on a particular ask, right? For about a year, we were floating around with the parties trying to figure out, like, what do you want to do? And we kept writing papers with a million options in them. Here are the 10 things you could do within the UNFCCC. Here are the things you could do to support the UN Secretary General Summit. Here are the 5 things you could do to react to the IPCC report on the ocean and cryosphere, et cetera, et cetera. And we really couldn't get the parties to focus on what they wanted to do until we narrowed it down to COP25, and then further narrowed it down to, all right, let's just take command of this, and let's just say that there should be a decision that does A, B, C, D, E. So anyway, one of the lessons learned for me was it's really good to zero in on a particular request, because otherwise people just don't focus. They've got a million other things to think about. So that was one. Another is to ask for slightly more than you think you can reasonably get. I think we were pretty strategic in that. We didn't go around advertising exactly what was extraneous in the proposal, but I think in our heads we knew that we could achieve our objectives with certain elements, and that we threw a couple extra elements in there, knowing that they could be stripped out, because I don't think you want to go in with your exact bottom line. So, but you don't want to go overboard and risk everything. We also took comments from, many, many countries and civil society groups in structuring this proposal. So I think we were pretty confident even before the COP that it would survive in some form. Anyway, those are a couple of my lessons learned.
Thanks. And a question for Jane. Just wondering if members of the House have fixed ideas on what they might want to introduce on the Ocean Climate Nexus in 2020, or if they are casting around for ideas from the NGO community and others.
I think that members definitely have lots of ideas, but I think they would also welcome input, welcome suggested opportunities, suggested solutions. I think it's both. I think they definitely have ideas, but they would welcome our input. And as I mentioned earlier, the takeaway from that roundtable last week was that they also are really looking to us as a community to continue to provide the messaging and the communications that support the need for action and really drive the need for action, and that can demonstrate the that the science supports the types of solutions we're talking about in a easy or easier to understand way, so that the need for action starts to become just sort of part of the general awareness and understanding. And I think right now there continues to be a gap, and many of the members agreed when I made this point last week, there does continue to be a gap in understanding, and many of you are already aware of this, that an understanding of, one, the impacts to the ocean from climate change, but also the opportunities for looking at the ocean for climate solutions. There is a significant knowledge gap in that area, and the members really are looking to us to continue to try and drive that message so that it becomes more broadly understood, but then also help support the need for action.
Thanks, Jane. So another question for Amanda and the California team are what topics and what pillars of the Pacific Rim Partnership are you thinking of building out in 2020?
So I think we're only just beginning to kind of think this through with our partners, and I can just report that in a really good conversation with Fiji, we identified a few areas. I mean, first of all, anything that we can do to increase our contribution to mitigation with ocean work, we would like to explore. So, what kind of nature-based solutions exist? What should be scaled up? What has worked? What has not? I mean, some nexus there with, sequestering more carbon is an area of interest. We're also really focused on building out protected areas. So to the extent that partners are interested in working on that, we would be very interested in expanding our work, whether it's a formal marine protected area or some other level or characterization of protection. And then I'd say the third issue area that we both expressed interest in was plastics, which is a huge issue for both Fiji and for California. And so just thinking about ways that we can partner in those areas, I think would be where we would start, but very open to other ideas that our partners are interested in. I think as people join, as more and more folks join, I think that we'll be able to kind of hone in with more confidence in areas that are of true interest for partners.
Thanks. So one more question for Sue on UNFCCC process. So given that the UNFCCC is a consensus body, which means that you can have just one or two countries blocking progress, someone wants to know if there's any possibility to change that to a different model.
Well, here's the problem with that. It's been an issue for like 30 years, right? Under the Framework Convention, I mean, you have to agree on the rules of procedure, which includes the voting rules. So the parties agreed on basically every other rule of procedure way back then, except the voting rule, because you didn't have agreement. I mean, some countries said everything should be done by consensus, and some countries said you should have, maybe a 2/3 or 3/4 requirement for certain types of decisions. The problem is, in order to change from a default rule of consensus to something like 2/3 or 3/4 majority voting, you need consensus to adopt that rule. So any country that doesn't want a 2/3 or a 3/4 majority rule doesn't agree to adopt a rule of procedure that allows that kind of a rule, if that makes sense. So basically, if you support consensus, you win by default because you don't agree to some other rule, and then the default rule is consensus, which sounds crazy, but that's kind of the way it is.
Thanks. And maybe also just to note that I think it really underlines the importance of these, coalitions of the willing coming forward with ambitious commitments to kind of set the direction of travel, right? Because the official negotiations track operates by consensus, it can't, it can never result in sort of that, guiding North Star of climate action.
I think that's absolutely right. I was going to make the same point, and I was going to say that one example of it, with respect to the market mechanisms issue that I was just saying, did not end up in agreement, is a bunch of countries issued their own principles at the end of the COP called the San Jose Principles, because they were developed at the pre-COP. And those countries basically said, like, here are the principles we're going to abide by in terms of transfers of allowances. And, in the absence of consensus agreement, here's what we're going to do. So it's another example. It's not exactly a coalition taking particular action, but it's a coalition abiding by a certain set of guidelines.
Great, so we're just about at the top of the hour, so thanks so much to the speakers for your insights, and thanks to everyone for joining. We have a selection of COP25 analyses and announcements on the Ocean Conservancy website for reference, and I think Theo will be sending around a follow-up email to registrants with the handouts attached. Feel free to reach out to me with any follow-up questions, and thanks again for joining.
Thank you.